Well, good afternoon, everyone. From wherever you happen to be sitting, welcome from Philadelphia. We are really grateful that you joined us this afternoon for this inaugural event of the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites here at the Weitzman School of Design. My name is Randy Mason. I'm an associate professor here at the Weitzman School and the faculty director of the new center. And I'm delighted to be joined today by three fantastic colleagues. Brent Leggs, the executive director of the National Trust African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. Kwesi Daniels, the head of the Department of Architecture at Tuskegee University. And Amy Freitag, executive director of the J.M. Kaplan Fund. Now, what we have planned for this afternoon is an hour or so of presentations and discussion. I'll ask my three colleagues to do a couple of rounds of short talks. We'll try to keep them relatively brief and keep the pace going. And we'll talk about the preservation field more generally and some of the more particular challenges when it comes to preservation of civil rights related sites and Black histories. Just a quick reminder that if you have a question or a comment to make, you're very welcome to do that in the Q&A button on Zoom, which I'm sure you're all familiar with by now. And at the end of the presentations and discussion among the panelists, we hope to have some time at the end to have to entertain some of those questions and to have a little bit more interactive end of the presentation. Before we jump into what we've planned, I thought it would be important to make an acknowledgement that of something that we all know, that we're all together in a moment of deep and very delayed reckoning with important issues of dealing with history, heritage, racism in this country. We didn't need any more reminders of it here in Philadelphia. Yesterday, we had yet another reminder of the damaged and fraught nature of our society these days, with yet another killing of a young Black man, William Wallace Jr., just a mile or so from the campus where I'm joining you today. We have to keep acknowledging this and keep confronting the truth of our flaws, and also to keep articulating our aspirations for how we want to change our society. But the question, how it relates to the center and what we're here to talk about today, the center really is organized and provoked by this question of what do we do as professionals, as preservationists, as historians, as designers, as leaders, as citizens. There are a number of things that we can do in response right now in the moment and off into the future and in the long term. And we want to try to focus in somewhat on that today through the perspectives of these amazing professionals who have been at work on these issues of civil rights, heritage, and Black histories for quite some time already. And we are very grateful to have them in different ways as partners in the work of the center that's only now just beginning. With that acknowledgement on the table, let's move into the more formal parts of the presentation or the webinar that we've prepared. I'm going to say a few words about the center itself, if we can share the slides, and then I'll begin to pass it off to my colleagues. So the center's work explores civil rights heritage and how the pursuit of and struggles over civil rights has shaped American society and the American landscape. As you'll hear in the presentations today, this work goes beyond interpreting civil rights with a capital C and capital R as centrally important as those stories and places are, to engage civil rights more broadly and as it is expressed and inscribed in American landscapes in myriad ways. The question that the center is really trying to engage in is what new kinds of places, what new conversations, what new partnerships can we cultivate as academic partners to help with this process of reckoning and acknowledging and making visible civil rights legacies. The mission of the center, as you can see here, is really designed to enable our school to collaborate better internally and externally, to contribute to the urgent matters of our society around us, and to realize both the values and potentials, but also struggle against the limits of what we as a privileged academic partner, a privileged academic institution can contribute to those already working in this space. We also mean to be a catalyst for change in the historic preservation field itself, which is much talked about these days and a very important issue for those of us professionally who identify as preservationists. The central activity of our center, and certainly in its initial years, is building partnerships and recognizing that the most important partners for us, building on the work we've already started with Tuskegee University, is acknowledging that HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, present an incredibly important set of partners and potentials to elevate the work of preservation to make these important histories and heritage sites visible and sustainable. We mean to continue and to deepen and broaden our partnerships with not just with Tuskegee, but with other HBCUs as well. I thought it would be important to put on the table at the outset an issue that we can come back to later. I hope we do. And that's, what do we mean by civil rights sites? I've already said that civil rights doesn't just mean the capital C, capital R issues and stories of the 1950s and 1960s and the laws and the famous places and people and stories. That means a broader set of struggles and aspirations. Similarly, that we're meaning site in a number of different ways, and we're exploring, especially in the first couple of years of the center's activities, what exactly we can put on the table in regard to thinking about civil rights sites and their preservation. Of course, we mean the iconic sites that are immediately recognizable to most Americans, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but just as profoundly the ordinary places that have been shaped by and have shaped lives struggling with and celebrating the victories of civil rights, whether it's the Main Street of Selma, as you see here, or the kinds of cultural landscapes that define whole cities and regions and settlements, like this rural church and school and burial ground that we can see from the air just outside of Tuskegee, Alabama. We also are wrestling with this idea that site also has to be explored figuratively, in the idea that stories and geographies, spatial patterns, laws, traditions, everything from foodways to art forms to zoning regulations are all part of this landscape of civil rights, and we need to reckon with those as preservationists as well. So down to some of the details of how we're going to proceed over the next few years, the center will be working on research and publishing as we must do as academic partners. We will be continuing to work with Tuskegee and other partners on training and convening, and we will enter into field projects where we can collaborate with important partners like HBCUs and related organizations in their communities. We will be working toward the goal of diversifying our own community and our own field. That relates to those of us here at Penn, in Philadelphia, in the US, in preservation. And initially, we are working on being engaged with partners in Alabama and here in Philadelphia to try to do some of that difficult work of understanding what it really takes to preserve and sustain and interpret civil rights sites meaningfully for the long future. So that is hopefully a relatively quick introduction to the center itself. In this one, I wanted to kind of start the rounds of asking our collaborators and partners to contribute, and we've asked each of them to talk for 3 minutes or so about the kinds of challenges that they see facing the historic preservation field broadly these days. There are a million possible starting points, and so with nothing more than that broad question to prompt thoughts. Let me first turn to Brent, and then Kwesi, and then Amy in turn.
So I first want to start off by saying I am delighted to join the team at the University of Pennsylvania and to be a senior advisor to the center. This is such a beautiful opportunity for preservation education, and it will lay the groundwork for the infrastructure to support the preservation of America's greatest gift, which is the legacy of the American civil rights history. So as I was thinking about this broad question that Randy posed, I wanted to frame this in 10 issues, but also 10 opportunities. And so I'm just going to highlight these briefly. So preservation today is not your grandparents' version of historic preservation. Preservation today is activism. It is advocating for equity. It is a tool for achieving justice. We advocate for equitable interpretation of America's history. We are evaluating the traditional systems and structures that have intentionally omitted and erased African American history and sites from the historical record. We've got a lot of work to do to catch up in that area. We are also linking together architecture and racial justice. In essence, preservation is political and has mirrored our social values. And with this new commitment to social justice, we can begin to elevate the significance of vernacular architecture as well as places designed by architects and professionals. It is critical that we begin to establish substantial new funding, again, to catch up and mitigate years of inequity, but also to fast track the preservation of African American historic places. Many are standing vacant, underutilized preservation projects lasting for 10 years just to get the doors open. That's not even sustaining the operations of these historic sites. We need new solutions to address issues such as gentrification, displacement, disinvestment, to catalyze the revitalization and reinvestment, or even the renewal of African American historic commercial corridors and historic neighborhoods. That is vital. We need to equip grassroots organizations, empowering them to demonstrate their exceptional stewardship capacity and potential, and to create new models of shared authority and governance at traditional sites. We have to create space for that. We need to develop a national plan and vision for documenting, mapping, and interpreting the Black experience in America. As preservation practitioners, we know that the first step is to identify and document. That leads to the protection and preservation of these cultural assets. We also have to collaborate with more artists, journalists, real estate developers, creatives, to be able to create an interdisciplinary team of advocates that bring exceptional expertise to be able to preserve historic Black neighborhoods and individual historic sites that are cultural anchors in these communities. We must begin the process of reinventing preservation education in the United States, not only to make the content relevant through the lens of social justice, but to begin to attract more diverse students that are engaged in this contemporary form of preservation work. That's how we cultivate and build the next generation of preservation leaders. We need to develop a national plan and vision for reimagining Confederate monuments in the United States. This hot topic will continue for the next several years. I'm sure you have been following what's happening in Richmond. My mind is blown by the reimagining of that cultural landscape and the innovation and preservation practice that's happening there. And again, we need to have a national vision and plan for the future of these statues and memorials. And then last, we need to explore our role in the preservation of the ephemeral, preserving murals and sites dedicated in memoriam to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. This history from the recent past, a living history, and ensure that we are documenting and recording these moments that hopefully will inform our future. So I just want to kind of close with, it is our work to create more space and to begin to increase the cultural and financial value of African American historic places and civil rights sites in the United States. Thank you.
Brent, thank you very much. Dr. Daniels, please.
Thank you, Randy. It's an honor to be surrounded by such fabulous folks. I just hope that I can, have a flame to match the quality of the folks that I'm with. Because the truth is, all of you have helped us at our program at Tuskegee carry forward this discussion in numerous ways, from funding to institutional support and capacity building. And so I'll say those are the three things, and I'll expand on those as well, that are needed. Funding. To do this work is difficult. We've been able to, I met Brett previously, but one of the most recent ones that both he and Amy collaborated, I don't know if they knew they were collaborating in that moment, was around this idea I had when I came back to Tuskegee about the necessity to document our history. Being an institution who was founded on students building the buildings on our campus, and we have some tremendous buildings, beautiful buildings, great stories, but they're in need of being addressed. And so the idea was like, well, if Booker T. Washington did it, we got to at least, we got to raise them one. I mean, we can't just let them go by the wayside. And so we called around trying to figure out how we could start something. And I remember when we found out that the Kaplan Fund was going to support the work that we wanted to do. There was an idea of, we want to do a workshop, to do some capacity building, some training of people in the community to understand the possibilities associated with preservation. And it literally came 1 second, we were trying to figure out where we were going to get some money. Next second, we had some money. It literally was just that fast. And we were not prepared that it would happen so quickly, right? So that's the necessity of funding. And then at the same time, on a call with Brent, we said, we got this great funding from Kaplan, and they had provided us funding through the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. We said, but we don't have any trainers. we need to meet some people. And then he connected us with Hope Crew. And, like I said, I don't know if the two of them knew it, coming together, that would form this tremendous partnership. But it proved to me that when you have an idea and you stay true to that idea, and if you're just bold enough to tell a whole lot of people about it, you never know what may come back. And so without that funding, we would not have been able to start our first workshop. We would not have been able to restore windows on our campus, would not have been able to train to educate our students about the possibilities of window restoration and brick repointing and learning about how our campus actually got built. Because one of the challenges with preservation is that these histories, these narratives that Brent spoke about, what's happening right now, if we're not documenting it, then in 50 years or 100 years, we don't know about its existence. So that the funding was extremely important, and the funding has allowed us to continue to do the tremendous work we're doing. So then it brings us to capacity building. We have to build the capacity. The work we're doing in Alabama, there's so much work to be done. I do not have enough students to get it done. I am actively recruiting. I think I need about another 500 to 1,000 students just to begin to start scratching the surface, because there's so much work. And that's only between, for me, that right now is only between Tuskegee and then the Civil Rights Trail of Selma to Montgomery to Birmingham. But we know there are all these other sites that are right outside of these main points. There are all these homes that were responsible for making this work happen. There are all these other states, Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Florida, who have very, very rich histories when it comes to civil rights that also have to be documented. This was a national story. What does that network look like? Because if we don't build the capacity of communities to address this work, we don't build the capacity of students to do this work, we don't build the capacity of schools to be able to do this work, then we cannot service the people that really need to be serviced. And then partnerships, with programming, the work that Penn has done with us. Last year we embarked on what I'll say was a very bold idea. We're going to do an HSR for an old antebellum home. And in that process, I learned there was a whole lot I did not know. But we got our feet wet, we dug in, and we produced a document. Well, I searched around trying to find somebody who could give us some guidance. And then when we connected with Penn, Randy said, well, I have somebody, Charles Lawrence, that's what he does. And came into the classroom, this has been a blessing of Zoom, of COVID. He could come into our classroom easily and have a conversation with our students. And we're now able to go back to that original document and pick it apart and see what areas we need to improve. And so when we look at the needs around preservation, it requires these partnerships. And there are many, many more that are out there. It requires these partnerships in order to find the funding, build the capacity, and then assist with the program.
That's great, Kwesi. Thanks. Three easy steps. Now we just have to repeat 500 or 1,000 times, right? Thank you. So Amy, please.
Well, these are hard acts to follow, Randy. I don't know how I got third place here, but that's a tough draw. But I'm going to do my best, because it's just a tremendous honor to join you and my good colleagues Brent and Kwesi this evening to discuss a topic that my colleague Will Reynolds and I have been truly blessed to be a part of at the J.M. Kaplan Fund for the last several years. So really for a decade or more, our colleagues in preservation have been concerned about the field, right? Losing ground of relevancy in the US. We worried that preservation was not part of a dynamic discussion about how cities must evolve to address climate change, affordability, and social justice. And let's face it, a disproportionate number of preservationists look pretty much like me, right? And furthermore, let's be frank, preservation and gentrification are too often seen as basically synonymous. Our National Register of Historic Places doesn't begin to reflect the rich history and diversity of people and places that comprise our democracy. Indeed, 50 plus years after the National Historic Preservation Act, we really feared that preservation was losing its relevancy. But that actually turns out not to be the case. In fact, one could argue that the power of preservation and memorialization has never been more potent. Just look at where the energy of the work lies. It's in the emerging program, preservation program at Tuskegee. It's at the National Trust. It's in the African American Action Fund. It's in the work of groups like Black Gotham in New York City that sell out late night walking tours of historic Lower Manhattan. It's in the creative rethinking of public monuments in Philadelphia, Richmond, and around the country. It's in the work of groups like Black Space that work with communities to hold memory, identity, and power in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods in central Brooklyn. And it's in the work of the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project. So I think the question is, how will the traditional field of preservation meet this moment? Will we do the hard work to recognize the implicit bias in America's preservation history and invest in a much richer register of places that matter? We believe that the future of the preservation movement requires investment in rising leaders of color, as well as initiatives that leverage the full power of our history and an inclusive and expansive group of cherished places toward the common good. To sustain us along this path, it will remain important to nurture connections between pillars of the conventional preservation community, like the University of Pennsylvania, and actors who have been tireless in their preservation work, even though it's been under-recognized and underfunded. Penn's commitment to the preservation of civil rights sites is a powerful step towards a richer, more dynamic American preservation narrative. And the Kaplan Fund is super proud to invest in this work alongside our efforts in Alabama's Black Belt, which I'm excited to talk about in a bit. So thanks for including us in this discussion. I'm looking forward to trying to keep up with my fellow panelists.
It's not a contest, and there are plenty of circles. We're all circling around each other. So if those were more general reflections on kind of where we are as a field, or where we are as I like to think of it as a community of practice, what I've asked my three colleagues to do next is to feel free to use slides this time, to talk about the field as they see it and the opportunities that they see, specifically through the lens of their own work. So I think this will be an even a more thrilling kind of provocation for those of you listening and watching, to see how work on the ground is being transformed through these three different professional lenses. So let me invite Brent to again start off, and we'll go in the same order. Sorry, Amy, but you'll get to be the conclusion once again of this round.
Sarah, can you advance my slide for me? I wanted to start out with this question: why preserve it all? So many of you probably have heard me talk about how I first came to the field of historic preservation. I was in grad school at the University of Kentucky, was invited to conduct a statewide inventory of historic Rosenwald schools in my home state. And I would discover that Booker T. Washington, the founder of Tuskegee University, Tuskegee Institute at that time, that he would partner with Julius Rosenwald and would create a new social movement known as Rosenwald Schools. And they would fund over 5,000 schools in 15 southern states. That the initial designer for the first school plans was none other than architect Robert Taylor, first Black graduate from MIT. And the landscape designer was none other than George Washington Carver. When I learned that there was a personal connection, that my mom and dad attended Rosenwald schools, I began to understand the quiet power of preservation to bring the past into the present, unlike any other form of history. And I've been dedicated to this work ever since. So I'm inspired by social movements because Rosenwald schools taught me that Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald's vision for uplifting the Black community was real and ongoing and had directly impacted my life through my family connection. That vision still lives on today. So I'm inspired by HBCUs, civil rights, abolitionist history, the story of Green Book, and even thinking about Victor Green. Literally, his work to create the Green Book was a response to a crisis in Black travel. And he would establish a network of more than 10,000 Green Book communities within this publication. That is a social movement unto itself. Next slide, please. So I see this work at the National Trust for Historic Preservation really building on this legacy of movement building in the United States. We established the Action Fund in the aftermath of Charlottesville in 2017. These three images from 2015 in Charleston, 2017, the middle image, where white nationalists are rallying around a Thomas Jefferson sculpture advocating for a new form of Jim Crow. And in 2018, our own National Trust Historic Site was vandalized with these horrible words. This really speaks to the role of preservation to fight racism and hate. And these places tell our shared story. Our response was to create a $25 million campaign, the largest ever undertaken on behalf of African American historic places by the National Trust, to set a blueprint, a new path forward for the future of the preservation movement in the United States. Next slide. Some of our work at the National Trust, and I've had the good fortune of being the project manager and senior advisor to help preserve places like the A.G. Gaston Motel in Birmingham, Alabama. This motel was constructed in 1954 by A.G. Gaston, the most successful Black entrepreneur during the period of segregation in Alabama. It's the first Black-owned motel. I can imagine that he would never think that the American Civil Rights Movement would descend on this space in the spring of 1963. Here, inside of this vacant motel, is where Dr. King, Reverend Abernathy, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, and countless unnamed foot soldiers and civil rights activists would break the back of segregation across the South. This place stands, it is the physical manifestation of their activism and their fight against immorality. This is a space where Black women, children, and men tested and affirmed the timeless idea that purposeful collective action can change our nation and the world. I'm glad to say that today it is the centerpiece of the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument, which includes 16th Street Baptist Church, Kelly Ingram Park, the Masonic Temple, 4th Avenue, St. Paul, and Bethel Baptist Church. Next slide, please. This is another place that's important in civil rights. This is the childhood home of the legendary jazz musician, Nina Simone. What I think is beautiful about this place is when you look at these simple, unadorned historic buildings, which reflects the majority of African American historic places, there is beauty imbued within this cultural legacy. It's also an opportunity for us to leverage the power of preservation to grow the preservation economy and to leverage our engagement with artists. 4 New York City-based visual artists, and as their form of arts activism and politics, would save this house from demolition, partner with the National Trust and others. And I'm excited for the future of this house and how this can be replicated in other rural communities. Next slide. I wanted to highlight Claiborne Temple. This is a national treasure campaign of the National Trust. It is one of our Action Fund grantees. We just gave them $100,000 for them to hire their very first preservation manager. This is a site where the I Am a Man posters that you see, they were pressed in the basement of this church. At this church is where Dr. King led 15,000 sanitation workers on a strike and march to City Hall in 1968. This is the place where political activism would evolve and become more sophisticated as the movement advocated for economic justice. This place has a bright future. Next slide, please. I want to just conclude with this idea that today in preservation, we continue to fight against cultural inequity and disinvestment. The 3 sites that I just showed, all 3 of them are vacant. Based on my experience, if I had to guesstimate, 90% of African historic places, including many civil rights sites, are either vacant, underfunded, underutilized, lacks the full expansive interpretation of their history, have not been fully seen as adding cultural and financial value, not leveraged for being the cultural anchors within these communities. There is great potential through new forms of partnership, interpretation, and community to elevate the significance of America's civil rights sites so that we begin to claim ownership and that we celebrate Black America for moving our nation forward along this long arc towards justice. Thanks.
I think a little bit of Zoom applause appropriate for, since we can't have the crowd applauding after each one of these talks, but thank you so much, Brent. Kwesi, would you like to start in next?
So when we look at civil rights and the preservation of civil rights, it's really about the narratives. The preservation of civil rights sites is rooted in acknowledging that Dr. King, before he passed, we picked up on a speech, you know, the "I Have a Dream" speech, and we've all loved it. We've all heard about it, and we've subscribed to it, but we didn't subscribe to all of it. We subscribed to the part that we felt was comfortable. We subscribed to the part that said that if we all came together, Black and white, that we would, you know, I guess, sing Kumbaya. And unfortunately, with the current state that we're in as a country, we realize that we have a long way to go. Dr. King left us with an ideology called the beloved community. And that ideology had very clear terms about how we need to do this work. And I believe that preservation holds the key to us actually doing the work and picking up where Dr. King left off before he was assassinated. And so when we talk about the work that we're currently doing at Tuskegee, the young lady here's name is Dominique Giles. She just graduated out of architecture. She stated that documenting historic structures has allowed me to become more articulate and detailed with the drawings that I produce. This experience has also opened my eyes to a career path in historic preservation. I've realized that I can become an advocate for preserving African American communities. For architecture, we're at a crossroads. The influence of technology is reshaping the way that we look at how we teach architecture. But preservation, there is no crossroads. We still need to document history in the same fashion. Here in 2020 or 2020, where everybody has a cell phone and has a computer, and everything we do is digital. here's a very analog experience. She is drawing the elevation of Old Ship AME Church, and at the same time understanding her opportunities within this space. Narratives. We had a chance to document the Harris House. Dr. Harris was a physician who, I say that he turned his house into an ark. We know of Noah's Ark because all of the different animals, in order to escape the flood, we had two different genders that all had to get on the ark in order to be safe. Well, that's exactly what the Harris House meant for the civil rights workers, the freedom riders, when they were accosted in in Montgomery. They came to his house, and he had recently made modifications to it. And as a result, his home, which was expanded to accommodate his family, was expanded to accommodate his extended family of civil rights workers. His recreational center became the site where the foot soldiers would eventually come together, and they would gather in the recreation room. And this spot right here is the spot that Dr. Montgomery, his daughter, who is now one of the caretakers of the home, this is where she said Congressman John Lewis sat. And Congressman John Lewis, this is before he was Congressman John Lewis. This is before he had done all the work that he had done. He said that this room right here, this room was the strategy room. The strategy room was the place where the leaders went to plan the strategies, which they brought back down to the foot soldiers. But because John Lewis was not a general, John Lewis was not a congressman, John Lewis was just a frontline soldier. He did not have enough privilege and clout at the time to step foot in this space. But this space is an indication of how these are the narratives you would not know if you did not document. By documenting this space, and it took us almost a day just to begin the documentation, because before you can do the documentation, you have to learn the history behind the place that you're in. We went across the street from the Harris House to the Benmore Hotel because we were given this narrative. We were told how the building was designed to be fireproof. And I scoffed because, our current building codes, all buildings are designed to be fire retardant. I didn't quite pick up the differences in the syntax. They didn't say fire retardant, they said fireproof. And it wasn't until I walked in the building and I saw the material that it was made out of, the same materials that you're looking at on the screen here, that I realized the genius behind the architecture. The building was actually designed to be fireproof. And when you understand the narrative of the civil rights movements, where there's this element called fire that was at the forefront of the minds of the men and women who lived in the South during that time, brick was a material that they always had to refer to, or some sort of non-combustible material, because bombings and fire was also present in all of their work, that they had to make fireproof homes and churches. And so this is, as I conclude, these are the drawings. As I mentioned earlier, when we got started with the work at Tuskegee, it began with the support of many entities, and the one that I did not mention in the beginning was the Historic American Building Survey. The HABS program is one of the strongest programs when it comes to the documentation of historic sites around the country. Been doing it since the Great Depression. Well, the workshop that we did, that we got to learn about restoring brick and restoring windows, it had another component that was specific to our architecture students. That involved our students learning the process of producing HAB documentation. And I'm proud to say that this summer, through the support of the Kaplan Fund, through the support of the Historic American Building Survey, we were able to hire students during the pandemic. Students who had recently graduated and lost internships, we were able to provide them internships. We were able to do something that is at the foundation of how the Historic American Building Survey got founded. Architects needed jobs during the Great Depression, and that's how HABs came about. Well, Tuskegee architecture students and alumni needed jobs, and we were able to hire them to document the sites, of which we were able to document Mount Zion AME Church. And as Tyler Littles, one of our students who's from Montgomery, noted, I was able to do preservation work pertaining to two notable civil rights era buildings in my own hometown. I learned a lot of information about Mount Zion and Dexter Avenue Parsonage and how important they are to the culture of my hometown of Montgomery and to the civil rights movement as a whole. So as I conclude, for us as educators, as an educational institution, civil rights sites and the work that we're doing has actually opened the door for our students to understand their place within America, their place within society, and their place within architecture. Thank you.
Fantastic, Kwesi. Thank you so much. As I invite Amy to begin her presentation, I just wanted to remind those of you viewing and listening to add whatever questions you may have to the Q&A tab, and we'll try to get to some of those near the end of tonight. So, Amy, please.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, this is not the wrong slide presentation that I brought tonight. This is actually the kind of work that the Kaplan Fund generally has done for much of the last decade. We've been working on World Heritage sites around the world. This is a Roman site in North Macedonia called Stobi. We've been working on World Heritage sites in conflict in places like Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen. And the point is here tonight is that we're talking about World Heritage here in the US. Our preservation roots really live in the US, and so in 2016, we funded a US World Heritage gap analysis that specifically identified civil rights movement sites were the critical missing piece in the history that we're preserving and presenting to the world. 2 years later, in 2018, 24 civil rights sites, churches and safe houses in the Black Belt of Alabama and the cities of Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham were listed on the World Monuments Fund Watch, a list of the world's 25 most important and endangered cultural sites. The nomination by the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute came with the critical assistance of our colleague funders, the Education Foundation of America. So really, what took so long? Why did it take over 50 years for this essential American story to be preserved and presented? And where was the preservation movement and preservation funders like us all those years? These are the omissions and challenges the Penn Center is seeking to address. Now, credit really goes, I think I need you to advance my slide, Sarah. Credit goes to these people, the private citizens who preserved and protected these places without grants, without graduate students, with little or no technical assistance. They preserved these sites because they knew that America's civil rights history could best be told by the people who witnessed it and the places where it happened. But it hasn't always been easy. Many of these historic sites are Black churches, as you've heard, and almost all of them were bombed at some point during the civil rights era in acts of domestic terrorism. And when Dr. Ralph Abernathy's First Baptist Church, also known as the Brickaday Church in Montgomery, was bombed, the parishioners requested a building permit to repair the damage, but the town offered them a demolition permit instead. Because not only did our government not support the preservation of these historic places, there is plenty of evidence that large federal highway projects were aligned to erase vibrant African-American communities and destroy the historic churches that had been the infrastructure of the civil rights movement. Places like Mount Zion AME Zion Church, now Memorial Annex in Montgomery, which was being drawn by the student in Kwesi's presentation. This church was cut off from its community with the construction of highways 85 and 65, and it was eventually abandoned. Fortunately, as you saw, it's roaring back to life thanks to the support of its parishioners, Tuskegee students, and significant support from the National Park Service. And while these grassroots preservation efforts and sheer grit has kept these places alive, time is truly running out. These stewards, many of whom participated in the marches and protests, are at the very end of their lives. So that narrative that Kwesi spoke of is a disappearing and fragile resource. In the past 2 years alone, we've lost 2 such witnesses and preservationists, Teresa Burrows at the top and Ella Bell below. They were among the founding members of the Alabama African American Civil Rights Sites Heritage Consortium. And Sarah, could you advance? This is a growing coalition of stewards of historic sites throughout the state of Alabama. Together, they are building power, sharing resources, and creating a forum for long-term preservation. But they cannot do this alone. They will need partners and they will need funding, lots of funding to stabilize and restore these historic sites. Sarah, if you could advance. In recent years, thanks to the leadership of Congresswoman Terry Sewell, a native of Selma, who is passionate about the heritage of her Black Belt district, as well as the ongoing work of the consortium, many of these historic sites have received competitive National Park Service preservation grants, like here at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. But the list of needs, as you've heard, is long. Grants alone will not heal the preservation neglect, if you could advance, Sarah, will not heal the preservation neglect in the Black Belt. It will take the power of institutions like Tuskegee, like Penn. It will take philanthropy and government to come together to support this conservation effort. One more advance. So the moment of this center could not be more urgent. The opportunity for us to respond to this historic neglect at this historic moment of racial reckoning is upon us. We applaud the many partners who have come together to lift up the civil rights history of our country and invite everyone to do their part in helping the Penn Center meet its goals. Thanks.
Many thanks, Amy. Fantastic. I did want to acknowledge, thank you all 3 of you for those great presentations. I did want to acknowledge behind the scenes, literally making things work today, and already in the center's relatively short life is Sarah Lerner, who's our coordinator and the person who makes most things happen, as well as a group of advisors and other collaborators whose names you can find on our website. And we would love to keep growing those lists of collaborators and partners and co-conspirators to try to pursue some of these challenges and some of this important work that Amy and Kwesi and Brent have really detailed for us. So I appreciate that a few questions have already popped up in the Q&A. Of course, I've been madly scribbling as my colleagues have been talking. I've got tons of questions of my own, and just because I've got the pulpit for the moment, I'll ask the first one, but encourage others to pipe in. These days, I feel like the super polarized nature of our society is always half a heartbeat away. In whatever walk of life you happen to be in, whatever time of day, whatever the political madness of the moment is, we have to confront the idea that that we are so deeply polarized in so many different ways. My question is, how does this come back to roost in the challenges and the aspirations of preserving civil rights heritage and addressing racial injustice issues through the power of preservation? I feel like on one hand, we've got narratives and places and people that we are keen to celebrate. And we also have shameful, violent, disgusting aspects of our history that we also need to acknowledge. And I guess my question is, how do we struggle with that? And what does that struggle begin to look like for the field? As we acknowledge that we have to do preservation kind of in both keys, in both veins. It's not a matter of self-editing so that we're only looking for one kind of story or another. If we want to really reflect in an accurate and faithful way what actually happened, what actually shaped our society. So I don't know who might want to take that up or comment on that comment, but I think that's a kind of waking up in the morning question for me most days.
Kwesi, you want to start?
I was actually going to extend it to you since you extended it to me. You beat me to the punch.
Well, I'm go ahead.
So I don't think that they're separate, right? When we look at these sites, many of them, this is all coming out of this history of terrorism in this country. But that's one lens we can look at this with. We can also look at it as a lens of resilience. We can look at it as the way out of no way, proving that the impossible is easy. And when I look at what's happening right now, I say that's why we can really learn from the work of the civil rights movement. We can learn from the work of preservation, because they will tell you how do you find success in periods of great despair. If you can literally walk from Selma to Montgomery, I don't want to drive from Selma to Montgomery, okay? If you can walk from Selma to Montgomery, then there's absolutely nothing we're dealing with right now that is insurmountable, because we already have a whole army of people who've already proven what is possible when the community comes together. And so I say it's not necessary to pull them apart. I think you want to keep them together, because it tells us how far we can go as a community, as a nation, as citizens in this country, to pull ourselves apart as a body. But it also shows you all the work that we can do to come together as one, to create a reality that says that we're all human.
I think that was beautifully stated. And that's the exact way that I view the dual narratives. In many ways, I've been thinking about the opportunity to balance public memory and how can we reconstruct national identity and define a new American culture and narrative related to civil rights and the Black experience. And what I mean by that is working in Birmingham. I naturally thought the community would celebrate its civil rights legacy. In many ways, they wanted to distance themselves from that history because it was painful and violent and reflected white terrorism against the Black community. And I started thinking about the ways that we have interpreted this history. It is often through the lens of fire hoses and police brutality and barking dogs and just the most violent aspects of society. We have not lifted up the resilience, as you just said, the power of the Black community to self-organize, to develop a shared vision, to consolidate limited resources, and to sustain our commitment in the name of justice and equality. So when I look at the future of interpretation related to the terrorism and violence, I think we need to begin to define that through the lens of the white experience and map those places to acknowledge how white America has created a culture of violence against Black people. And on the other hand, we need to help Black America understand the almost the hidden power within our cultural legacy, that we are preserving the culture of activism, resilience, resistance, and that's where our power lies.
I'll only add to that because both of my colleagues are so darn articulate on this topic, but I will say that to me, and this is something we've actually been having active conversations with the consortium sites in the Black Belt about, is there a role for these sites to play in this very charged moment around voting suppression? How these sites lift up the optimism of people that they will have their votes counted, that they will be able to, they will fight for and they will get their vote. Because you only need to walk through the sites, the incredible Equal Justice Initiative lynching memorial, and look at the column dedicated to Lowndes County, Alabama, and to see the fact that they needed very small font to get all of the names on that column. Those were many people trying to fight for voting and for their basic civil rights. That landscape of Lowndes County is full of historic sites that can lift up the triumph of the people that have really persevered. So this is a very rich landscape. It's a very motivating landscape. And I think there is plenty of history there to encourage people and to bring it to the moment that we're in, to really suggest that people will seize their moment and seize their voice, and all Americans need to fight for the voting rights that were so hard fought for in that landscape. So particularly relevant this week.
Amen. Everyone should go out and vote if you haven't already. So there are some really wonderful questions that have come in, and I wanted to kind of package a few of them in order to address as much as we can. There are a couple of questions, particularly the ones from Ama Asamoah and Ariana Thomas, I think both associated with Tuskegee, that are tapping into this question about how we deal with Confederate monuments, with Jim Crow monuments, with a former slave market in North Carolina. How do we, I guess, not just what's the answer, but what's the process by which we find a societal answer to these sites? As we've all alluded to it before, I know, Amy, you've been involved in the city of New York in one way to kind of process publicly what happens. So I wonder if you could all just reflect on what you see maybe happening next in a kind of profound medium-term way as we wrestle with these monuments to white supremacy in public space, buildings at universities named for slaveholders, slave markets, and so on. How do you? What's next for these types of heritage sites? Amy, can I single you out? Because I know that you've spent a lot of time.
Pick on me, Randy. You spent a lot of time. I got my friend Brent here. He's a great resource. Look, I mean, I think this is a very tough and very challenging, but very rich moment to lean into and to find, the resources and the expertise to support these sites. What concerns me, and we've all addressed it tonight, is that there are so many holes in the infrastructure that we need to support these sites and to really help with the reinterpretation of sites, the sort of recontextualizing, that there's so much work to be done. And I feel like there's only so much, right? There are only so many phone calls that Brent Leggs can field in a day. And that it's going to be university partners like Penn and institutions that can partner with historical HBCUs and others to really create the infrastructure that is trying to support this massive number of omissions and problematic resources, these vacancies that Brent has spoken of. That it is a tidal wave of work. And I guess I lose sleep at night thinking, where are the catchers? Where are the people that are going to be there to sort of be the infrastructure to lift up and to assist communities to move through these conversations? Really, really tough. And I think we're going to need Penn and a whole lot more university partners, a whole lot more civil partners and funders to step up to make sure that there are the resources to grapple with these at a moment where we can really make ground.
I'll just add that I think it's important that we create a truthful landscape, and I would be cautious to support the erasure of history, even though it's difficult. Now, the relocation of Confederate monuments out of public space, because we should be asking ourselves, what history deserves the prominence of that public space that is articulating our contemporary civic identity and values? But when I think of an urban slave jail that's in Alexandria, Virginia, the Freedom House, the city of Alexandria created a co-stewardship agreement with the Virginia chapter of the National Urban League. They were struggling to retain stewardship and to fully care for the building. Now the city owns it. They have partnered with African American community organizations. And so this idea of co-stewardship agreements to support the long-term stewardship of these kinds of places, collaborating with the community from the very beginning to develop the interpretation plan, the community programs, so that the Black community can take ownership and reclaim this space, even if they don't have the actual ownership of the property. And then I think the opportunity is really growing shared governance and authority. That begins the process of dismantling the traditional systems and the way that we've governed, interpreted, and preserved presidential homes, or, like I said, an urban jail in Alexandria, Virginia. We've got to create that space so that African Americans are leading all aspects of the preservation of this history.
There were a couple of other questions. Kwesi, I didn't want to cut you off if you wanted to add something.
Just quickly. I share the sentiment. I'm very cautious with the narrative of the Confederate sites, because one, we have to make sure we don't lose sight of what the goal is. We don't want to take all the energy that's being pushed out there to address issues around racism due to police brutality and not wrap that all up into the Confederate sites and believe that now that you get rid of those, we're now, we're peaceful again. Also, I'm very careful about saying, let's move them, because we all know we're in a capitalistic society. Here you have this Confederate statue that now whoever gets it, they now have something that's valuable. I own this thing that you've just increased its value because it's now it's one of those Confederate sites or Confederate statues that used to be at that location that's now in my archives. So I think we got to be careful about that as well. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, we have to be careful about the erasure of history, because when you pull it out, then the generations that come behind, they don't know anything about that experience. And then we can easily say what we did post the civil rights movement. Because I have a Black person in my class, we're integrated. There's a Black person who lives on my block, we're integrated. And then when we have situations like now, where you see white nationalists with tiki lights gathering around a Confederate monument, and we're like, how did we get here? It's because we never left here. We just believed that because we appeased or answered one question, we checked off one box, that we checked them all off. And so while I believe that the Confederate monuments do need to be taken down, I think that we need to be very clear and deliberate about how we do that work to make sure that we're telling the true narrative. We're telling both stories. The Confederate, while you're happy to deal with that, that is also terrorism. I heard about one Confederate monument they were taking down that always sat in front of a courthouse, and many of them do. How can we actually get true due process when you have a symbol of terrorism that's right in front of your courthouse that already tells you what direction you need to be voting as a juror? whether you acknowledge the symbolism and its impact on your thinking or not, it is there. And so I think we need to be very, we need some reconciliation. Definitely need some truth and reconciliation, and we can do that around the monuments. But I think we need to be very deliberate in how we engage with them.
That's a fantastic set of points, Kwesi. It occurs to me that the preservation field, when we're at our best, brings a particular kind of accountability to history through the lens of materiality that I think will be really an important part of how different parts of the country reckon differently with these issues. And I think it's really important in a way to see that in the same frame, preservation bringing accountability to, as you're saying, Kwesi, erasure, the potentials of erasure as well as the potentials of preservation. Keep that in the same frame with all these amazing work about creating new monuments and next monuments. My colleagues Paul Farber and Ken Lum and their many collaborators have done an incredible job of making visible these issues about how to make the next memorial. I think that needs to go hand in hand to how we deal with our inheritance in both the kind of visible and invisible, fixed and ephemeral forms that we receive it in. Certainly no easy answers. With time kind of running down, I did want to try to mash together a couple of the questions again that the folks in the audience are pulling in. One of the realities about the preservation field is that it is super hierarchical. It has very long been dominated by privileged people and privileged institutions. And that we are in a process of at least questioning that, hopefully also changing it. My institution and my department and myself, we need to thoroughly examine what we do or should be doing differently in order to address that as well. So there's no escape from it. But a couple of the questions asked, kind of in a more straightforward way, Jeremy Wells asked, what's broken about the field of preservation and what could be fixed? In more simple terms. And I'm sorry, I'm taking liberties with your questions, all of you. And then Bill Adair, who's our colleague and also an advisor to the center, asked a kind of a differently oriented question about the same point. What can white preservation professionals do that is not going to reinforce the top-down privileged perspectives that the preservation field has been built on? Another easy to answer quick fix for our panel.
I'll defer to you. You hit the button fast. So.
All right. So I'll start with the second question. White professionals can understand that you are an ally and that you bring specialized expertise to the work. I think Amy and Kaplan are the most beautiful example of collaboration and the way that white professionals can use their access and privilege to bring resources to the preservation of civil rights history, to make the connections across traditional institutions to advance documentation and innovate places like Tuskegee University. I think the bigger question is, how do we scale that up to address and confront all of the issues that we've discussed today? I think that is the real opportunity. And it would be great if architecture firms across the United States would convene with us and let's set out a 10-year plan for equity-driven outcomes to be able to achieve a meaningful goal for the preservation of civil rights sites. There's so much opportunity in that space. Mm-hmm. Then to Jeremy's question, how do we begin the process of shifting pedagogy within preservation programs? We need more diverse representation. That's why what UPenn and the center is doing is creating space for African-American leaders like myself and Kwesi. We need to begin the process of valuing preservation practice as much as we value preservation theory. And then I would just say the last is I would encourage every preservation program to reevaluate your strategic plan. Look at the language within that. Are you using language like equity? What are your specific outcomes and goals for recruitment? And have you done an evaluation of your curriculum to ensure that every single class is focused on some aspects related to African American history or other diverse communities?
So I'll take a crack at that from the philanthropic perspective, Brent. I think the notion that it should be in the funding profile for any organization that's receiving preservation funding,
Yes,
to be addressing equity, right? It's about, really the leadership of great foundations like the Ford Foundation and Elizabeth Alexander at Mellon, who have really put this question of justice on the table for philanthropy. And I think it's got to be the fundamental, actually the sort of litmus test to say, if you're going to be able to get funding, you have to be investing in this. And I think the will is growing, but it could be stronger. I should also just say that preservation funding has really been waning in America. And, I think we need to see that this work isn't this like precious little thing that goes on a shelf in a museum. This is about how cities like Selma are going to come back. This is about economic development. This is about opportunity. This is about jobs. This is not about like a fancy little museum situation. This is about actually changing people's lives. And if preservation's really lucky, they'll jump on this bandwagon, right? If they're really lucky, this is where relevancy lies, is sort of in helping shape communities in the future. So preservation should wake up. Get on.
Amen.
I completely agree. And I'm going to just add to a couple of these moments. Allyship, I totally agree. If we did not have these allies, we did this work previously. In 2008, we did this work with the Shiloh Rosenwald School. And I got a chance to see what it was like from a grassroots level to do this work. But I also got a chance to see what it was like when funding came in. And if we're really going to be serious about this, if we want to change it, we got to get to the DNA. And Brent got to this with the idea of the curriculum. Schools of architecture particularly are governed by our accrediting bodies. Our accrediting bodies give us the roadmap. It's not all prescriptive, but it is a roadmap for how we need to do this work. And preservation has always been regarded as a side to the architectural curriculum. So that means that the ideas of looking at culture, looking at people, addressing the inequity that has existed through architecture over time, terms like gentrification now, these are not embedded in the thinking of architecture because it's not embedded within our curriculums and it's not demanded by our accrediting bodies to address that. So if we want to do large scale change, we have to hit it at the accrediting side within the curriculum. And I think that's the biggest piece that I'll add to that part.
Thanks, Kwesi. Time is running short, and there are a bunch of really great questions that are queued up. And I'll thank those who wrote them and let you know that we'll reply directly to you with either kind of answers back or maybe a suggestion that we can work together in the future about other discussions that bring up questions of law, of funding, of technical issues, or the role of digital documentation. There are a lot of great suggestions in there. I wanted to bring up one last thing though, and it's one of those ideas that's kind of followed me around as I've started further down this path, working with you all on these issues of Black heritage and civil rights histories. And that's the reality that civil right, while the African American experience is extraordinarily meaningful, important, and difficult when it comes to issues of civil rights, it's not the only civil rights issue. that is acknowledged. It's not the only set of civil rights issues. I've had great comments from colleagues and students and friends about, well, what about the civil rights issues connected to immigrant communities or LGBTQ issues or narratives about Latinx people and places. Those are all incredibly substantial and significant on their own. And I just wanted to kind of acknowledge on one hand that that we are committed to working with our already engaged partners, Kwesi, Brent, Monica Rhodes, Amy, and others who are part of our circle, to pursue this one particular but particularly important aspect of civil rights heritage. All these other opportunities are there, and we hope to shed light on them as well. But I wonder if in a last sort of quick go-round, you all could reflect on what is or what should be the relationship between Black heritage and civil rights issues, civil rights heritage, and these other aspects of civil rights heritage that other aspects of our field and our society are advocating.
I'll just say that for the last 5 years, we have advocated for increased federal funding, equity funding to support the preservation of civil rights sites and HBCUs. And so we've been able to partner with Congresswoman Terry Sewell and Congressman James Claiborne and have secured almost $100 million in federal funding to diversify National Park Service programs. That's the HBCU grant program, the Civil Rights, the Underrepresented Communities grant program, which is meant to diversify our national inventory of historic places and those stories. And then we've established 2 networks, the Civil Rights and Reconstruction Era Network. I'm bringing this up to say that we successfully advocated last year that $2 million of the Civil Rights grant funding tells the story and preservative places related to the all-American civil rights history. And that we understand that it's important for us to preserve places like LULAC in Houston or the place associated to Cesar Chavez, all of the civil rights sites that helps to tell our full national story. And I think this is the kind of story that empowers diverse communities that continue to fight for equity and equality in the United States. And as Kwesi said in his earlier remarks, in this moment in time, there's nothing like civil rights sites to provide wisdom to empower us in this moment and into the future. And we can build that kind of power for other diverse communities when we help to preserve their civil rights legacy.
I agree. I think sometimes sometimes you have to start somewhere. And one thing that was powerful about the civil rights movement is that it was not titled the Black movement. It was titled the Civil Rights Movement, because it was understand that this is it's a human issue. The idea that I'm going to mistreat you because you're Black means that the reason why this is being able to be adopted by every other diverse body of citizens in this country and non-citizens in this country is because we're talking about basic human rights. I don't want you to sit next to me, so I lynch you. I don't want you to look at me, so I lynch you. I don't want you to vote, even though you have that right in this country, and so I lynch you. And so the fact that we're now saying, let's look at how do we preserve this, it means that we are looking at the curriculum from the educational side. We have the ability to turn that curriculum on its head and say, let's look at all of these other communities. And because I literally just came off another call where we're asking this question, and the truth is most curriculums do not know how to deal with equity because we do not have a society that's built on equity. And so because that society is not there, if we start with the space where it began, which was civil rights, that opened the door for all other communities to have the conversations they're having now, then that means we will open the door for us to understand how to preserve these narratives. I don't know your culture, but I now need to learn your culture in order to address the needs of your culture. And so I see this as really a springboard for us to delve into much deeper issues around Indigenous rights, around LGBTQ rights, around spaces that have been instrumental to shaping this country. And we've decided that we don't want to acknowledge it, around immigrant rights. We don't want to acknowledge it, yet they shape the country we're in. And so the work that we do, I believe it sets the foundation for everyone else to be able to have this conversation.
Well, here. I think we tend to oversimplify things and put them in buckets. I don't think they're bucketable. I think they are. This is a rising awareness about our lack of sort of a broader memorialization of who makes America and who makes America great. And so I don't think it's coincidental that the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project is emerging at the same time. I don't think there's, these are sort of a rising tide that's lifting many, many stories. And I think for us to think that these things are somehow divorced from one another is lunatic, because I think in many cases, these monuments hold power for all of us, as Kwesi's saying, and that we should not significantly sort of bucket them as a Black site versus a Latin American site versus a Native American site. This is something we're going to learn a lot about doing together, and it's going to be a big project, but it's going to involve a lot of histories.
If I can add one more point, the thing about this is that we create the avenue for communities that are not part of the mainstream to acknowledge their history and culture is important to be brought into mainstream. And so if I went to school, we can look back at education and how it's been used to erase the identity of cultures. We can say, let's reverse that and use education to celebrate the diversity of cultures. And so I can actually go to each one of these cultures, as I said, we're going to address their needs. And I can say, we're going to talk about civil rights sites that deal with the civil rights movement of the 1960s. African Americans, you got to be the ones having this conversation and directing how we go about doing this work out of respect for that. If we're going to deal with Native American culture and the Native American story, if we're going to deal with LGBT stories, and we need to go to that culture and find the people who can have that conversation and say, you are the leader of this. But what I can do is I can bring you the skills and the tools that are needed in order for you to document it. Or better yet, I just provide some of the tools that you already have them. I can just supplement your skills and your tools with an understanding of how to frame that, whether it's from an educational side, whether it's from a funding side, or whether it's from a capacity building side. But we can support them and allow them to elevate themselves within that space, and we can find some humility in the process.
I can't think of a better note to finish on. Kwesi, Amy, Brent, these are all incredibly helpful and searching and meaningful presentations and notes that you've given us. Happily, this is recorded, and so people can go back to it later. People who haven't seen it can see it. We can assign it in classes next year, so that next year students can have benefit of this as well. Apropos the season, I'll just say in closing that if you three were on the ballot, you'd all have my vote, and I would gladly follow you into whatever comes next. I think this is a great start for this center, and I would encourage all of you who are interested in the work to keep track of us on Twitter at Civil Rights Sites, on the Penn, the Weitzman School of Design website. And we will be back to you soon with more events and more research and hopefully more progress on these important issues. So thank you very much to the three of you and to Sarah Lerner in background, and good night.
Thanks, Randy.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.